This is how to assemble B2-EMO's Imposs-A-Drive. It's going to be in 4 parts. Part 1 is how to do the motor box, and then we'll do the leg, and then we'll do the mount to the body as separate units, and then we will do how to put it all together and mount it onto the droid. First thing you need to do is clean up the print. Believe it or not, this area here is an integrated support. It's intended to print kind of messy, so just make sure that none of that stuff is impeding the the wheel. So I'm just going to break it out. You can take a X-Acto knife and just kind of cut the big strands. None of this stuff is structural. It's all the structural stuff is hidden beneath it or above it as it prints. And since some printers have problems with this, I just added an extra layer. And as you can see, it's all just kind of frangible. It breaks away. So the only other attention area you might need on the cleanup is so that your collar will fit in nicely. A little filing maybe here, depending on if you have elephant's foot in this area or not. And that's pretty much it for the setup. This piece here is a single print. There's some print in place supports that you need to clean up. Usually you can kind of work your knife underneath those and pop it off. I've already done it. Sorry I didn't video it for you. But depending on the resolution of your printer or how clean your printer prints, it'll be more or less difficult to get this piece off. But that's what it's supposed to look like, because it fits into the wheel like that. In fact, we will start with this piece since I've already got it kind of set up. So to do this, we're going to need the axle. And this is important because we're going to be aligning bearings. And if you screw the whole thing together without the axle in it, you can get the bearings slightly misaligned, and that will cause you grief later when you try to put the axle in. So mount it with the axle in position, and that way the bearings will be perfectly aligned for where they're supposed to go. So step one, I always say step one. Start with the bearing in either side. And just kind of align those bearings into the slots. And then one piece goes on each side. And make sure these holes for the screws line up with the holes in the hub so that the screw will pass through. And I'll just take a look-see. Nope, didn't get it. There we go, got it. Then you take these 65mm counterbore type M3 screws, just slide them in, and there's a little overlap that catches the outer race that holds the bearing in. And then you just take 4 M3 screws, and that captures the bearing on the other side. To tighten this, just start the nut into the bolt. Don't tighten it down just yet, just get it started. As you can see in the design, these nuts also hold the outer race of the bearing. All right, so when you get the all the nuts started and captured and the bearings captured, it's important not to get these slightly misaligned. So make sure your shaft is going through both bearings, and then tighten it in a star pattern. So just snug it with no slack, then go opposite to no slack, and then go to the 90 degrees off, no slack, no slack. All right, so now they're just, and then just kind of put some torque on it here to make sure that the bearings are perfectly aligned with the shaft and they're not being twisted by your tightening pattern. So we'll go in a star pattern and just kind of tighten them down slowly, just a little bit at a time, each step testing to make sure that it still spins freely. And you don't have to go hog wild with these, but you want to make them kind of even all the way across the board so that the bearings are not misaligned. You make them tight enough so they don't work their way loose. They don't have to be super tight. You're not trying to break anything. All right, so that is step one, getting the wheel put together. We'll set that aside, and then we'll put the linear bearings onto the motor mount box. This can be a little tricky just because of the geometry. So what I tend to do is take a long screw that you're not going to use, just to kind of set these screws into the housing here. Just bolt and get each of the nuts captured into the frame of the motor box. And that can be a little tricky depending on your dexterity. Just put that in there and then just pull it in to the frame so that it seats. If you can't get it to seat because your printer's a little sloppy or blobby like this one is, you may end up needing this long screw later to help pull it in. All right, so that's pretty good. I find a pair of tweezers is helpful in this build. And really all we're doing now is just kind of seating these nuts into place. So right now I have a 30mm bolt. The design calls for 25. You can put 30s in there. It's actually easier to assemble that way. So I'll do the one below that, and we'll come back to that one. So this print is a little bit sloppy. I printed it with a high layer height, so it's not as exact as, say, if you print it on a Prusa with a 0.2 layer height. This is a 0.3 layer height on this one with a 0.6 nozzle. You can print it with a 0.4 nozzle, just use 0.2 layer height. That's going to give you the maximum strength. And the other thing I usually do, if they come out a little oblong, All right, so all the holes are in, all the nuts are in there. And this one will probably work with our 20mm or 25mm bolts. All right, so that one's caught. This one may or may not catch because it wasn't seated all the way. Yeah, it's not going to catch. So what I'm going to do is use my 30mm bolt to pull that nut in. And then I can put a 25mm bolt in there once it's fully seated. And again, the cleaner your print, the less of this you'll have to do. This print's a little sloppy. All right, so that one's caught. This one is also going to need to be pulled in. And there's nothing wrong with using the 30mm bolts, except they're a little bit more expensive than the 25mm bolts. So if you have extra 30s, you can just put these in. It's easier to assemble, but believe it or not, I was trying to keep the cost down. All right, so I'm going to repeat this process for the other bearing, and I'll be right back. I've got both of the bearings mounted. Tighten them in this star pattern again. And the reason for doing that is we don't want to tighten one down and have it put stress on the build. So you kind of do one at a time, a little bit, a little bit, a little bit, in a star pattern. So both bearings are mounted with the 25mm screws. And now it's time to mount the motor. So I've got M3/8. If you don't have M3/8, that's fine, but don't use anything longer than an M10. And again, we're going to do this star pattern. Just get all the screws started. And then we will go with that star pattern again. So just snug each one down. Then tighten them. And you don't have to over tighten them. There's lots of screws here doing the work. All right, so now we have that. Let me get to the difficult part. I only say that because it's a little tricky. And what I found is helpful is to have a something that is about 6mm to help you set this up. I just happen to have extra shafts. You can use anything that will kind of do the same job. So what I'm going to do is go through and mount from each side. So I didn't quite file this out enough. Just getting the rough edges off and the elephant's foot until this fits in without a lot of friction. Okay, so I've got my collar mounted, and then I'm just going to stack up a washer and then a bushing on this side. Just pull this all the way back as far as it'll go. And then on this side, the bushing and the washer goes here. So I have that, so it just barely extends there. And this is the tricky part. Now you have to let this, get this whole assembly into this chamber and have that bushing sitting in its right spot. And this is a little tricky. Because the clearances are really tight. All right, so that's working so far. I just need to get this axle, there we go. And then do the same thing on this side. Just kind of wiggle it around. And push this axle all the way through. There we go. And then make sure it spins. There might be a little play in there, that's okay. We're going to line up wherever it wants to be with the gear motor here in a second. So just tighten down this collar. So that way it captures the whole axle into the motor box. All right, that's looking good. This just spin freely now. And the last step is to put the motor gear onto the assembly. We take a sonic hub. It's got a D shaft on it. This little part with the hub on it goes inboard. And just line that up with the D shaft. And then we're going to mount this onto the sonic hub in place. And the clearances are so tight, you can't really do it ahead of time, so you have to do it afterwards, which is a little bit unfortunate, but that's just physics. I find it helpful to take some tweezers just to get started. So once you have them all started, go back with your star pattern and snug them up and then tighten them. Okay, so the gear is on the drive. Right now it's loose. I'm gonna kind of spin it, see where it wants to naturally be. Just snug it first, and then tighten it. All right, that's tightened on the shaft. And the last thing we want to do is give it an operational check with the power supply if you have one. Just make sure that everything runs smooth and there's no grinding or any misalignment. So I'm using 24-volt motors. Plus and minus don't matter. And if you want, you can run it in both directions. All right, seems to be working nicely. The motor box is fully assembled and ready for the next step.